The gavel struck today at 2 p.m., and while the echo of that sound is ricocheting through the halls of Congress and the breaking news chyrons on your television screen, I want us to pause and look at something most people are missing in this moment. You are seeing the headlines about the end of an era, the 67 votes, and the historical weight of a Senate conviction. But what we are actually witnessing is a stress test of the American capitalist architecture itself. This is not just a political event where one man loses his job and another takes his place. This is a seismic shift in the management of the state, which is effectively the largest corporation in the world. When you look at your screen, you see a president being removed, but when I look at the markets and the machinery of institutional power, I see a system frantically trying to reprice risk. The 67 votes for conviction are not just a tally of political will. They are a signal to global capital that the board of directors has decided the CEO is no longer a viable asset. That sounds cold, and perhaps it is, but we need to strip away the emotion to understand how this affects you, your job, your savings, and the grocery bill you just paid this morning. Most of the commentary you will hear over the next 24 hours will focus on the drama. They will talk about the stunned silence in the White House residence. They will speculate on whether Donald Trump will walk out of the executive mansion or be escorted out by the very agents who swore to protect him just hours ago. These are compelling images, and they speak to the human element of power, but they distract us from the mechanics of what just happened. The United States Senate, acting as the ultimate arbiter of constitutional compliance, has executed a clause that many thought would never be used. In economic terms, this is a liquidation event. The political capital of the Trump presidency has been zeroed out, and the assets of the executive branch, the nuclear codes, the command of the military, the diplomatic channels, and the regulatory agencies are being transferred to new management. You might be feeling a sense of shock or perhaps relief, or maybe deep anxiety about what comes next. That anxiety is rational because markets hate uncertainty, and right now we are in a moment of maximum uncertainty. But I want you to understand that while the figurehead is changing, the underlying machinery of the state and the economy is designed to absorb this shock, even if the transition feels chaotic. Let us look closely at the specific details that have emerged. Reports confirm that as the final I was recorded, the Secret Service detail shifted their protocols. This is a fascinating glimpse into the bureaucratic reality of power. Power in a modern state is not magic. It is procedural. It is written in codes and protocols. 1 minute, an individual is the commander-in-chief holding the monopoly on violence and the authority to move markets with a tweet. The next minute, a legislative switch is flipped, and that individual is a private citizen. The swiftness of that transition, the deactivation of the codes, the removal of Air Force One from his command, all of this illustrates that the office is distinct from the man. This is a concept that is crucial for understanding how our economy functions. We rely on the stability of institutions, not the whims of individuals, to secure our contracts, to protect our property rights, and to ensure the value of the currency in your pocket. When that distinction blurs, when the man becomes the state, we drift toward instability. Today, the system asserted that the office is paramount. This assertion is the bedrock upon which the confidence of investors and workers relies, even if you do not feel that confidence right now. You need to ask yourself what this means for your daily life. The immediate reaction in the financial markets was likely volatile. Algorithms react to headlines faster than humans can process them, but beyond the intraday swings in the S&P 500, we have to look at the longer-term fiscal and social implications. A removal of a president is a disruption of the policy pipeline. Executive orders that were being drafted are now dead letters. Trade negotiations that were in progress are now frozen. For a worker in a manufacturing plant in Ohio or a tech employee in California, this means a pause in the rules of the game. Capital tends to sit on the sidelines during moments like this. Businesses delay hiring, factories delay expansion. They wait to see if the transition of power will be orderly or if it will be contested in the streets. This hesitation is where the economic danger lies. If the transfer of power remains purely legal and bureaucratic, the economy will digest it and move on. If it spills over into civil unrest or prolonged legal battles that challenge the legitimacy of the Senate's vote, then we are looking at a different kind of risk premium, one that could devalue the dollar and spike interest rates, making your mortgage or your car loan more expensive. We are watching the chaotic transfer of power as we speak, And the question of whether he walks out or is escorted out is more than just reality TV drama. It is a signal of the rule of law. If the removal is physically enforced without violence, it sends a message to the world that the American system, flawed and battered as it is, still functions. It tells the bond market that the United States government pays its debts and honors its laws. If there is resistance, if there is a standoff, that risk premium goes up. You are the stakeholder in this drama. You are not just a spectator. Your tax dollars fund the salary of the Secret Service agents who are right now navigating this unprecedented protocol shift. Your labor fuels the economy that is holding its breath. We often think of politics and economics as separate spheres, with politics being about values and economics being about money. But today proves they are inextricably linked. The vote in the Senate was a political act with profound economic consequences. It was a decision to prioritize the stability of the constitutional order over the tenure of a single leader. As we parse through the rumors of his refusal to pack his bags, we have to recognize the immense pressure on the institutions right now. The military, the judiciary, and the civil service are all being watched. In a way, this is a test of the deep state, or rather the administrative state. I use that term not as a conspiracy, but as a description of the permanent infrastructure of government that persists regardless of who wins an election. It is the gears and levers that keep the lights on and the checks going out. That administrative state is currently performing a complex immune response. It is attempting to eject a component that the legislative branch has deemed incompatible with the system's operation. This is rare. It is messy. And for you, watching at home, it can feel like the ground is shifting beneath your feet. But remember that capitalism requires a predictable legal framework to function. When a leader acts outside of that framework, or when the political consensus fractures so deeply that governance becomes impossible, the system suffers. The removal today can be viewed as an attempt to restore equilibrium. Whether it succeeds in doing so, or whether it deepens the fracture, is the question we are going to explore. We need to look at how we got here, not just the scandals or the sound bites, but the structural failures that made this confrontation inevitable. This was not an accident. It was the result of decades of economic divergence and the erosion of trust, which we will unpack as we go further. To understand how we arrived at this historic rupture, we have to look past the headlines of the last few months and rewind the tape to the structural foundations of this crisis. We did not get to a Senate conviction simply because of a single phone call, a specific document, or a momentary lapse in judgment. Those were the sparks, certainly, but the fuel had been accumulating for years. We got here because the friction between democratic governance and the accelerating demands of a customized, personality-driven executive branch became unsustainable for the broader economy. In economic theory, we talk about institutional constraints. These are the guardrails, laws, norms, independent agencies that prevent any one actor from seizing total control of the market or the state. For a long time, the investor class and the political establishment tolerated the erosion of these constraints because the short-term returns were high, tax cuts were passed, deregulation was aggressive. The stock market, a crude but powerful metric, climbed. But there is a tipping point where the dismantling of institutions stops being profitable and starts being an existential risk. We reach that point. Think about it like a business. If a CEO ignores safety regulations to boost quarterly profits, the stock might go up for a year, but eventually the factory explodes. The Senate vote today was the shareholders, represented by the political class, deciding that the factory was about to explode. They realized that the volatility of the executive had moved from being a useful disruption to a systemic liability. When the rule of law becomes optional for the leader, contracts lose their enforceability. When trade policy is decided by a midnight mood swing rather than strategic calculation, supply chains shatter. You felt this. You might not have realized it was connected to constitutional law, but you felt it at the grocery store when prices spiked because of supply chain chaos. You felt it in the uncertainty of your employer who hesitated to give you a raise because they didn't know what the regulatory environment would look like 6 months down the road. The removal of the president is, in this light, a desperate correction mechanism. It is the system trying to claw its way back to predictability. But why should you specifically care about the restoration of predictability for the donor class? That is a fair question. You might look at the Senate and see a group of wealthy individuals protecting their own interests, and you would not be entirely wrong. However, in our current capitalist structure, the stability of the state is the floor upon which your economic life is built. If that floor collapses, the wealthy have parachutes. They have offshore accounts and diversified assets. You do not. You have your wages, your home equity, and perhaps a retirement fund tied to the market. When political instability rocks the currency or spikes interest rates, it acts like a regressive tax. It eats away at the purchasing power of the working and middle classes first. So, while the Senate's motivation might have been self-preservation or the protection of capital, the consequence of stabilizing the government prevents a much darker economic spiral that would have landed squarely on your shoulders. We have to talk about the mechanics of this high crime that led to the conviction. Without getting lost in the legal weeds, the core issue was an abuse of power that threatened the integrity of the state itself. In economic terms, this is rent-seeking behavior taken to its absolute limit, using public office not just to influence policy, but to privatize the very machinery of the government for personal benefit. When a leader treats the Department of Justice or the military as a personal retainer, they are stealing from the public trust. This is not an abstract concept. Public trust is an asset. It is what allows the government to borrow money at low rates to fund roads, schools, and hospitals. It is what makes the dollar the global reserve currency. When that trust is debased, the cost of everything goes up. The risk premium on American debt rises. That means higher mortgage rates for you. It means higher credit card interest. The corruption at the top bleeds down into the ledger of every household in America. The build-up to this vote was a period of intense paralysis. You saw it in Congress. Legislation stalled. Budgets were held hostage. The entire apparatus of government was consumed by the defense of or the attack on one man. This opportunity cost is massive. While we were fixated on the political survival of the president, we were not addressing the housing crisis that is pushing families out of their neighborhoods. We were not fixing the crumbling bridges or the underfunded pension systems. We were not debating the future of automation and AI that threatens millions of jobs. All of that vital economic work was suspended in favor of this constitutional drama. Now that the gavel has fallen, there is a chance to restart that engine, but we cannot pretend that the damage vanishes instantly. The polarization that protected the president for so long is still there. The media ecosystems that profited from the outrage are still there. And the deep economic anxiety that drove voters to support a disruptor in the first place, the feeling that the system is rigged against them, has not been resolved by this vote. In fact, for many of you, this removal might feel like the ultimate proof that the system is rigged. If you supported the president, you might see this as the establishment crushing a dissident voice. If you opposed him, you might feel that justice took far too long. Both feelings are valid reactions to a political economy that has stopped delivering shared prosperity. The swamp that was promised to be drained is actually a complex ecosystem of lobbyists, corporate interests, and entrenched bureaucracies. Removing one man does not drain it. It merely resets the management. The challenge now is to see if the new management acknowledges why the disruption happened, or if they simply go back to business as usual. If they choose the latter, we will be back here in 4 years, perhaps with a more disciplined and dangerous version of what we just saw. Let us look at the winners and losers in this immediate aftermath. The biggest winner today is institutional stability. The Federal Reserve, the Treasury, the global markets, they are breathing a sigh of relief. They crave order. The biggest loser politically is the brand of populism that relies on chaos as a governing strategy. But the real question is where you fit in. Are you a winner or a loser in this transition? If you rely on a steady paycheck and a functioning government to provide services, you arguably gain from the cessation of chaos. But if your economic grievances, your stagnant wages, your rising healthcare costs remain unaddressed by the incoming administration, then this victory for the rule of law will feel hollow. We need to watch the next few weeks closely. Will the transfer of power be followed by a transfer of resources? Will there be a policy shift to help the people who felt so left behind that they wanted to burn the house down? Or will the establishment simply patch the roof and ignore the rotting foundation? This is where the concept of moral hazard comes into play. In economics, moral hazard is when you take risks because you know someone else will bear the cost if things go wrong. For years, political leaders have engaged in moral hazard, stoking division, and undermining norms because the cost was borne by the public in the form of social unrest while they kept their seats and their influence. Today, the Senate finally imposed a cost on the risk taker. They said, no, you cannot liquidate the Constitution for personal gain. It is a start, but it is only a start. As we move into the mechanics of how the transition actually works, we need to keep our eyes on the money. Who is funding the transition? Who is advising the new president? The names in the Rolodex will tell us more about your economic future than any speech given from the Oval Office tonight. Now that the oath has been administered to the former vice president, who is now, by operation of constitutional law, the president of the United States, we enter a phase that in corporate restructuring is known as receivership. The state is technically under new management, but the balance sheet is still loaded with the toxic assets of the previous administration. You need to understand what this specific interim period means for the economy because it is distinct from a standard election transition. In a normal election, a new team comes in with a mandate, a platform, and a transition team that has been prepping for months. Here, the transition is immediate, traumatic, and legally contested by a significant portion of the electorate. The new president inherits the title, but does not necessarily inherit the political capital required to govern. They are operating with a deficit of legitimacy in the eyes of the ousted leader's base, and a deficit of trust in the eyes of the opposition, who sees them as complicit in the very administration they just condemned. This crisis of legitimacy is your primary economic risk right now. Why? Because a weak executive cannot pass legislation. They cannot negotiate robust trade deals because foreign partners know they might not survive the next election cycle. We are looking at a period of legislative paralysis. For the markets, paralysis is a double-edged sword. On one hand, Wall Street often likes gridlock because it means no new regulations and no new taxes. You might see the stock market rally in the short term simply because the threat of erratic executive orders has vanished. But for the real economy, the economy where you work, buy groceries, and pay rent, paralysis is dangerous. It means that if there is an external shock, like a spike in oil prices or a new pandemic, the government lacks the cohesion to respond effectively. We're effectively flying the plane on autopilot while the pilots argue in the cockpit. Let's look at the personnel, the cabinet. In a standard removal or resignation, there is often a mass exodus. We are already seeing reports of resignations from key posts, agency heads who do not want to be associated with the fallout, or loyalists who are walking out in protest. This creates a vacuum in the administrative state. Who runs the Department of Transportation today? Who is signing off on agricultural subsidies at the USDA? These are not glamorous questions, but if you are a farmer in Iowa waiting for a check or a logistics manager in Memphis waiting for regulatory clearance, these questions determine your livelihood. When the top layer of management vanishes, the bureaucracy slows down. Decisions get kicked up a chain of command that no longer exists. This friction acts like sand in the gears of the economy. It slows down the velocity of money. It delays projects, and ultimately, it suppresses growth. You also have to consider the shadow presidency. Donald Trump is now a private citizen, but he is a private citizen with a massive database of supporters, deep connections in the media, and a war chest of political donations. He does not disappear. In fact, stripped of the responsibilities of governing, he becomes a pure volatility engine. He can critique, attack, and mobilize without having to solve any actual problems. We have seen this in emerging markets where ousted leaders remain powerful, destabilizing forces. This creates a permanent risk premium on American assets. Investors have to price in the possibility that he or a proxy returns to power on a wave of grievance. This keeps long-term investment capital on the sidelines. Why build a billion-dollar factory today if the legal regime might be upended again in 2 years? That hesitation translates directly into fewer jobs being created in your community. And what about the pardon power? This is the wild card. Will the new president pardon the ousted one in a bid to heal the nation, as Ford did for Nixon? If they do, they risk alienating the very coalition that supported the removal, leading to civil unrest and strikes. If they don't, they risk the prosecution of a former president becoming the central narrative of the next 2 years, sucking all the oxygen out of economic reform. This dilemma is not just political, it is a fiscal trap. It guarantees that the political bandwidth of the country will be consumed by legal battles rather than economic solutions. We are essentially trapped in a litigation cycle. And as anyone who has been involved in a massive lawsuit knows, the only people who get rich in a litigation cycle are the lawyers. The shareholders, that is, the taxpayers, foot the bill. Let's zoom out to the international stage. The dollar is the world's reserve currency because the United States is viewed as the safe harbor of the global economy. That status allows us to run massive deficits and keep your mortgage rates relatively low. But today, the world watched the American president be removed by his own legislature. To a banker in Zurich or a central planner in Beijing, this looks like instability. They are quietly asking, is the US still the safe harbor? If they decide the answer is no, or even maybe not entirely, they begin to diversify. They buy less US debt. Yields on Treasury bonds go up. And when Treasury yields go up, the interest rates on your credit cards, your car loans, and your student loans go up. The cost of living is directly tied to the world's perception of our political stability. The Senate vote preserved the rule of law, yes, but it also exposed the fragility of the system. We are now paying a fragility tax on every dollar we borrow. This is where the class dynamic becomes stark. The wealthy can hedge against a weakening dollar. They can move assets into gold, crypto, or foreign real estate. They have access to the financial instruments that profit from volatility. You likely do not. You are paid in dollars, you save in dollars, and your biggest asset, your home, is denominated in dollars. If the currency weakens because of political chaos, your labor is effectively being devalued. You are working the same hours, but your paycheck buys less global buying power. This is the invisible cost of the crisis. It's not a line item on your tax return, but it is a theft of your wealth nonetheless. The removal of the president was a necessary constitutional hygiene measure, perhaps, but the economic infection it revealed has not been cured. It has just been exposed to the air. As we move into the first week of this new administration, watch the Federal Reserve. They are the firefighters in this scenario. They will likely issue statements reaffirming the stability of the financial system. They might even pause interest rate hikes or inject liquidity to calm the nerves of the bond market. This is the Fed put. The idea that the central bank will always step in to save asset prices. But every time they do this, they distort the market further. We also need to talk about the revenge policies. The ousted administration had dismantled many regulations. The new administration will be under immense pressure to reinstate them immediately. This regulatory whiplash is a nightmare for small businesses. Imagine you run a small manufacturing firm. 3 years ago, you were told you didn't need to buy expensive scrubbers for your smokestacks. Today, you might be told you need them installed by next month. That cost comes out of your payroll. It might mean firing 2 people to pay for a compliance upgrade. Regulatory stability is almost more important than the regulations themselves. When the rules flip-flop with every political purge, it becomes impossible to plan. And without planning, there is no investment. Without investment, there is no growth. We are entering a period of regulatory reactionism, where policy is shaped not by economic data, but by a desire to erase the legacy of the previous occupant. This is governance by spite, and it is incredibly inefficient.